Okay, so welcome to Web Foundations. This class is an introduction to web design. With this class, you'll essentially learn how to build a basic website, and we'll talk about that today. So what experience do you need? Uh, the experience that you need is very little. Mainly some type of technical experience, which is you feel comfortable sending an email with an attachment and replying to that email. So going into your Gmail or whatever email account that you're using, put an attachment there, and then send that email. At that point of technical expertise, you should be great for this class. Of course, knowing how to use a web page and things like that, a typical web page we have would be great as well. Outside of that, you do not need any pre-existing skills for this class. The software we'll be using are all free and available softwares. So with those softwares, with the software that we're referring to is software like Sublime Text. We'll be using things like GitHub. We'll be using a server and those kinds of things. And they're all free to use. And they should be able to be used on pretty much any type of computer, even like a Chromebook or something along those lines. There are solutions to using it there. There are no books involved in this class, only online tools. And there's a lot of online tools on learning how to build a website and lots of video tutorials outside of the one that we do for this class. So if you find a voice that you like online via YouTube or wherever else, great, use that. That's awesome. And tell us about why you like it and what you're using. And then if you find websites you really like, we're going to show you a couple that we like. If you find other ones, please share it with everybody as well. That's great. The coolest thing about this class is most classes and instructors are going to tell you not to plagiarize, not to look at other people's work, but actually the foundation of learning web design is doing exactly that. We are going to be looking at other people's code, using that code, but the important part is that we kind of understand what's going on there so that we can modify it and use it for our own purposes. So this class is a designer's approach to learning essentially web design, and then we could extrapolate that farther to like computer science or something along those lines. And let me explain a little bit what that means. Old school computer science class, and then even some computer science classes that exist today, are going to expect rote memorization. So you'll have tests where you have to bubble answer things or fill in the blank on how a website works or what the actual, to rewrite actual code without a computer or, or within a standardized test. We don't do any of that. Once again, you'll be using other snippets of code, copying and pasting code, using resources over that period of time. You will use things over and over again where you will start to memorize. And the more you memorize, the better, to be honest. That's great. It's just we're not going to be testing you on that. We are going to be testing you on the projects that you create for the class. So what's more important is how did you use that code to make something unique, interesting, and giving it your own voice, things along those lines. The other thing is we're going to simplify elements to understand interactions. And what that means is, once again, when you're learning how to build a website, and this was actually based on my own personal experience when I was a younger person, I did actually go to a city college where I went to learn how to build a website. It was a Dreamweaver class, actually. And I stayed in that class for, I think, one whole session. I almost didn't even make it through the whole session. The way they were talking was way over my head. They were using vernacular that I wasn't really familiar with, and it wasn't really condensed to bite-sized chunks that I can understand. Later on, I would learn from teaching this and working with our students who are designers and artists and visual learners, is that they like to learn in a way where they're playing with these different elements, but that everything is defined. And therefore, if you just give them something at the top of a web page, which we would call like the head of the page, if you think of a human body, the head of the page, and then there's another part that's called the body of the page where you write your content, kind of like a newspaper, right? The head of the page actually doesn't look visually, doesn't create visual representations in a way that is very easily defined. It's a little bit more abstracted in the process. So what I mean by that is you might affect things visually with the head of the document, but really it's in that body of the document when you're learning how to build a web page. That's the only area that really affects what there is visually. So if you think of a newspaper and you put like a headline and then some paragraph text, that's only going to happen in the body. And if you want to modify that, it's only going to happen in the body. And when you're first learning how to build a web page in a computer science class, they're going to show you the head of the document and all these more complicated features that are going on in order to build your web page. And what I find is that if you show that early on, when people are modifying that heading or that paragraph text, they think when it doesn't work that it might be because of something that was going on in the head of the document. And that's often not the case. I would say 95% of the time during our first few exercises or weeks in this class, that will never be the case. So why confuse you with that? Therefore, what we're going to do is we're going to focus and simplify those elements, focus on the body. We might throw some other stuff in there, but really minimal amount of stuff to get that page working. So we play around with that element and we see how it interacts with the elements within itself. And then we move on to those other elements and we try to do the same. And that's what I mean by simplifying elements. We try to kind of narrow down and look at the interactions of that chunk of code or that object of code at one time and then move to those others. And at that point, then you start to understand how they're interacting with each other and where those hierarchies happen and things like that. So that's what's going to really make this different. If you have a family member or you have a computer science background and they look at how we're teaching how to build our first web pages, they'll probably flip out. And if they do, we're really sorry. Lastly, pick up what you can and keep moving. So the last part is if this is your first coding class, first of all, it's a great way to start learning how to code. So if you hear about programming all the time and you're like, hey, I need to learn how to program, this is a really great way to get started. But there's going to be a lot of terms sent your way. There's going to be a lot of vocabulary. Pick up the ones that you understand and then just keep moving along. Kind of think of yourself as in the ocean. Things are floating by. The stuff that you can grab, bring them onto your raft, and the other stuff, let it float by because they're going to float by again. And when they float by again, it might make more sense at that point in time. So keep that in mind. Sometimes people just go through a class like this multiple times, and then about around the second time, they're like, okay, now I get it, how to do this stuff. And it's just kind of getting comfortable with the language and how things work. So this is what we'll learn. We'll learn HTML and CSS. We'll learn HTML5 and CSS3. And I partition those two things based on what we said before. We're going to learn really basic HTML and CSS, and then we're going to formally learn how to do a proper website, how they would do it with HTML5. And we'll use some of these cool dynamic elements of CSS3. We'll also focus on canonical HTML elements. And what I mean by canonical are kind of the ones that have been around forever. And stuff like making a link, making a button, creating stuff like going to other pages, basic CSS and stuff like that. So those are kind of the canonical elements that are timeless. After that, we'll learn old school layout, which is called kind of absolute positioning and relative positioning. And so with those two, they're kind of a hassle to do, and they're not so much fun. That's why we kind of make the assignment for it. We try to make it as fun as possible. But they're important to know how to do because they work on a micro level to play with elements, and they never really disappear. So it's important to know what they do because they will impact you as a web designer later on. Then we'll learn grid layout, and that's the new school thing to do, which is building these grids and formalizing your documents and your layouts with grid layouts. And if you look at any website, pretty much these days, I would say 99% of them, they're using these grid layouts in order to organize elements. It makes your life a ton easier, which is kind of interesting. There's this interesting curve, kind of learning curve throughout the class process, which it starts off with an incline, and a bit that you have to learn and a new vocabulary and stuff like that. But then once you get to 5, it kind of levels out and gets a lot easier for a while, which is really nice. Because some of these other things are harder to manage and work with. And we'll explain why they were that way before and why they're not that way now throughout the class. Then the next part, we'll learn our media queries, which are cool because they can make your web page both a desktop version and a mobile version, but a iPhone version or Android, a tablet, and a desktop version, and then even versions beyond that. So those are kind of cool to learn. We're going to learn those in a very basic way. And then lastly, we're going to learn Bootstrap, which is a framework for building websites that incorporates all of 1 through 6, but they abbreviate most of that stuff. Because they abbreviate it, that's why we go through the different steps. So by the time we get to Bootstrap, we understand what those abbreviated terms are doing. And that gets back to what we said before. If you try just jumping into Bootstrap, you're going to get pretty far in the beginning, but then you're just going to fall into this pool of knowledge and you're going to be like, what's connecting to what? How do I get them to work together? And the cool thing is by the time we get to number 7, you're going to really know how to build a Bootstrap site and feel pretty confident about it. And your final project will be a Bootstrap site that turns out quite well. We've had some really great results from the final projects. Things to keep in mind during this class. Always prepare for a portfolio. So even if you're actually currently working, which we have people who try learning at this point that might already be in some type of design field, or you're just starting out learning how to code and stuff like that, always keep in mind a portfolio. Put in that extra effort. It might take an extra day, might take an extra 10 hours, might take an extra 20 hours. But if you can make each assignment or each kind of project that we create, we have about, I would say about 4 or 5 website projects that you'll create. If you put in that could be more substantial, if you put in that time to make them a little bit more substantial, you'll really gain a lot in the end. And one of the reasons for that is when you go to an interview later on, it'll already be at a point that you feel confident showing it to somebody. A lot of times, and that also might mean, by the way, that you might, after getting feedback or after you've built in the first place, you might want to spend an extra 10 hours after that, right? And just clean it up and make it look nice. Because when you actually get that interview or it's time to show somebody, you have so many other things on your plate at that point in time, you're not going to want to go back to that project and figure out what you were doing back then and figure out and optimize it. Rather, it's nice that it's already in some type of form that's presentable. Next part is do it yourself. So yeah, you can copy from other individuals. You can, copy and paste and kind of plagiarize content. And I'm sure there'll be some people, for some of you, that'll help you guys out through the process. But at the end of the day, do it for yourself. Figure out how it works and try to create it yourself, because there's tremendous value for understanding how HTML and CSS works that go way beyond just building a basic website and will really impact you in so many different areas and fields throughout the rest of your career. Also create a comfortable environment. And for this, I'll stop sharing for a second just to kind of show my desktop. So this is my desktop. We'll actually learn how to, if you actually look at my browser too, I'll open up a browser window and you'll see that every one of my tabs when I refresh gives me a different color palette. That's because I like this stuff. This is called the Color tab, which is a Chrome extension plugin. And it's fantastic, by the way. Like when I open up my computer, I'm not getting news shouting at me or things like that. And I enjoy working on this environment, right? I throw all of my stuff into this landfill folder. If I open that up, it would look like the chaos of, most of our desktops usually. And instead it's just removed by one level. And I just clean it up by throwing everything in there and then checking it out later on. That's a simple, of course, unorganized way of going about it. And of course, you can add more organized processes, which I should do too. Also, when you're building stuff and you're making your sites, pick content that you enjoy, right? So that you're working with and playing with material that excites you, or at least, makes you enjoy looking at the screen while you're updating, because you're going to be looking at it for a while. So make some thought processes into before you even start making some little projects when you get started, right? What, if you're a parent or of children, maybe use your children in there, or something your child might like that you could show to them later. If you're a friend, use some type of, hobby or something cool that you could show them, or you even for yourself. So if it's a band or music or whatever it is, choose stuff that you enjoy looking at and working with. It'll excite you and make you want to go farther, and actually make you enjoy the learning process a little more. And I recommend doing that with pretty much everything you guys do with education. Master a problem-solving workflow, and that actually dovetails into it. So the most important thing you're going to learn in this class is just how to leverage multiple different media inputs and put them together to solve your problems. So that might mean learning how to search better with Google in order to solve your problem. That might be finding that type of tutorial that you like to learn from, whether it be like a video tutorial or whether it be PDF tutorials or things like that. Get comfortable with doing that and kind of swimming between these different problem solving areas and these different challenges, and using these different tools, and get comfortable with those, because you'll use those for everything moving forward. That's the new dynamic way of working in general. And if you can start getting good at that, you could pretty much solve most of the problems you're going to have, or at least be able to figure out how long it'll be to solve that problem and start scaffolding a plan to go about that. So really focus on that and think about how you're trying to solve these problems and how you're leveraging these tools. There's no one right way for everybody. So try to figure out which way works best for you. And then lastly, be mindful. Be mindful of your instructor. Be mindful of each other. Try to use everybody's time wisely and respectfully. And I guess you get the idea with that. If you're not familiar with being mindful, maybe look it up. There's some good YouTube tutorials on that kind of stuff these days. Okay, so that's the beginning kind of our class. Now I'm going to jump into the history of the internet lecture as well. Okay.